So, Sunny, can you tell us what it is that we want to discuss today? Because it's based on what you've been working on.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, a colleague at University of Southampton who's in the business school, he's an academic consultant, knew my background in philosophy, and he wanted to know whether, my background in philosophy at least, there was such a warm reception towards social constructivism as there is in the social sciences across universities in the lands, especially in education studies. And I said, it's um it's not as warmly received in philosophy as it is in social sciences. And that was quite surprising to me when I entered the social sciences. So he was kind of looking for confirmation because he was in an environment where he was told explicitly in a PhD supervision session where he was a supervisee that you better well be a social constructivist in a bit more colorful expletive language. And he was like, well, this is a problem. If something is so dogmatically asserted, that's always a warning sign. And so basically, he looked to me for some kind of confidence and confirmation. We realized that we are kind of a minority voice, say, in the field of learning development, which is what I used to be in prior to working in ed studies. And so we wanted to take on the theory of academic literacies, this kind of notion of placing student agency front and center of developing academic discourse. That's a very crude nutshell of like 25 years of research, but it draws heavily on social constructivism for its kind of epistemic weight, as it were, and not just epistemic weight, a lot of ontological weight as well. And so he approached me as a philosopher, and I was all too obliging in saying that, yeah, I have some problems with social constructivism. Whilst we use it and whilst we champion it, over and above what we see as more kind of, say, traditional conservative approaches, such as behaviorism on the end of another spectrum, or cognitive constructivism as a kind of on a spectrum working towards social constructivism, I'm much more sympathetic towards the claims of critical realism, the school of Bhaskar, and this idea that social constructivism at its quote unquote worst or most extreme leads to relativism. And that's a very naughty chair in philosophy that basically in layman's terms or layperson's terms, each to their own. And that's like a trigger for me. If a student says each to their own, I'm like, oh, shivers up my spine. I was like, no, we have a problem. We cannot live in a society, or we cannot be in a classroom or a teaching environment where it's each to their own.
Why
There are
not?
because therein lies no moral you can have no moral argument against Nazism or genocide or anything of that nature because it's each to their own. That is a highly problematic situation to be in. um, we need to have some sort of normative ethics or some sort of framework on which we can agree on for society to function in a kind of healthy manner. Otherwise, each to their own leads to no justifiable argument against the most extreme forms of behavior. And if we then kind of they scale it down and say, well, not everyone's a kind of genocidal Nazi or something like that, and they're not, right? Many people, most people are generally somewhere in the middle. There might be, say, vegans, and there might be meat eaters, say, in a classroom, right? That's something that's a bit less kind of heavily loaded, although not necessarily. Some people are very, or climate change. Take climate change, for example, how kind of emotive that topic can be for some people, feeling the need to chain themselves to buildings, and to imprison themselves in defense of their beliefs. So social constructivism, this idea that I need to be careful with this. Actually, I want to clarify at the outset. Social constructivism, I understand, is how individuals mentally or cognitively construct reality, and social constructionism with an N is more focused on the social aspects than individual aspects. But they're generally subsumed under this kind of umbrella term of social constructivism that basically argues that cognitive processes and social processes take part in the social construction of knowledge, and understanding the world as it is. That there's not a real world out there per se, but that we construct it collectively through discourse being the operative word here, through dialogue. Um, Practice is situated, context is important, and I'm not disputing any of those things. I think all those things are important: context, situationness, grounded theory, who you are as a researcher, the observer effect. All of these things matter. They absolutely matter, and I take on board all of those things. And I'm not a hardline realist thinking that there's some sort of platonic realm of forms out there that we can chip away like sculptors and get closer to the truth. I don't think
Mm.
that's how it works. I think it's much more we're dialectically enmeshed in the world. We're in the world, we act upon the world acts upon us. But extreme forms of social constructivism or relativism um, leave no room for the kind of world as is. And I
Mm.
think that therein lies a problem. We almost have, and even if there is no world as is, and it is all socially constructed, even if it is, ironically, we still have to claim some sort of ontological or epistemological basis upon which to have any kind of discourse. Otherwise, conversation actually can't get off the ground
Mm,
because we'll all be on sand. We're like, well, I don't disagree. I don't see where you're coming from. That's the end of the conversation.
mm,
So there has to be some sort of epistemic or ontological grounding that this is where we're coming from to actually get anywhere. Even if we
mm,
don't believe it, we have to kind of play devil's advocate, say, or grant the other person's point of view or a different point of view some sort of epistemic status to get
mm,
anywhere. So social constructivism, while it sounds great and it sounds progressive and it sounds empowering towards the student, it's something that I think, and I certainly do in my practice. I'm sure, and I know you champion it. You are all coming here with prior knowledge and experience, and that matters. And I want you to bring together your forces, like was it like Power Rangers or something? You join your pieces together and become like a new superhero. And that's
mm,
true. But there are also some claims or some observations that students will make and lecturers will make that do not withstand scrutiny, and they need to be revised or shot down.
mm.
That's how knowledge advances. We
Okay.
can't.
But before we kind of like get into a bit more, I'm just thinking about if there was, and I'm not claiming that there is, but if there was a spectrum
Yeah.
where, from what you're saying, that social constructivism is on one side of it, where it can like have the extreme form of what it is. In your view, what's the other extreme?
The other extreme is that the Platonic form of realm of forms, right? There's kind of give a Plato 101 here, but so there's like an ideal theory of form. So there's an ideal version of a table or justice or whatever it might be, and through chipping away at our reasoning and ideas, we can get to the kind of Platonic realm of ideal forms, be it ideal table, ideal justice, ideal beauty. And I don't ascribe to that theory. I think, I mean, who's to decide that there is such a realm of forms? It's a metaphor that's doing a lot of heavy lifting there, metaphors upon metaphors, and it's not actually how I think the world is. It's not. There's not this world out there that we can get through, and some people have apparently a better ability to get there than others because they grant themselves that authority. Well, I see the world properly because I'm closer to this form. On what basis? I think so that's the other end of the spectrum of kind of relativism and this kind of ontological security of Platonic realm of forms and this hardline realism. And I
Mm,
think where I would and I've cited social constructivism in Vygotsky's Mind and Society 1978 in my fellowship application. We all kind of cite it, especially in learning development and education studies. We all call ourselves social constructivists, but I was like, if I really reflect on what I do, I'm not a social constructivist per se. I would say I employ those strategies in a classroom, this group discussion activities within a classroom. But I would say, again, my background being in philosophy, not in as a PGC or in education studies, I have been trained in the Socratic method, which is, or Plato being the mouthpiece of Socrates, about leading people to where you want them to go, saying, I facilitate or guide the discussion. But that is not social constructivism. You have an idea of where you want the student to go, ILO's, intended learning outcomes, and they might be quite precise, they might be quite vague about skills or kind of temperaments you want students to develop without clear answers, especially in the social sciences where there are no kind of say hard line answers per se. But the Socratic method, which is something I definitely employ, I'm the guy who asks the questions and students get very annoyed at that. I had a student this year past, one of my supervisees, no names, who got quite angry with me and used some colorful language and said, why can't you just give me clear answers? Everyone else gives me clear answers except for you. Why you have to be such a and colorful language there? And I said, well, first of all, we can't use language like that. But I said, secondly, because I don't want you to create a situation where you just rely on me to tell you what I want you to do, I employed a Socratic method. It was about something to do with their dissertation and what the literature review should involve. So there was a normative correct answer.
mm,
It's not correct to say this can be socially constructed and you can just create your own literature review. There's some guidance here of what we expect
mm,
from a student and rigor in terms of the rubric, what we expect a good literature review, an effective literature review to do. So I was trying to guide the student there, knowing full well that they probably knew what to do. And I
mm,
just wanted them to do the thinking and articulate aloud what they thought. But they were getting fed up of me just constantly doing that. I was not backing down in that method. They wanted me to affirm, just tell them what to do, which is
mm,
behaviorism, right? Which is kind of
mm,
leading towards realism. This is the correct answer. You do this, and I can guarantee I'm going to give you 85. That's what they
mm,
wanted. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not a hardline realist or kind of behaviorist, but neither
mm,
am I a social constructivist to the extreme of saying, well, you do what you think's best. in this context, which would be facetious because I know there's a better way to do it. That would
Mm.
be saying to the student, do whatever you want and let's see what happens. But
Mm.
that's not each to their own, you know?
Do you think, like, in terms of pedagogy or, approach to teaching, that's the kind of common understanding of what social constructivist is, in terms of like how would you actually facilitate that type of
Yeah,
teaching learning?
that's the thing. See, people, I've written my notes here. It's kind of seen as a grand unified theory, to use Ben Kurtz, who's a philosopher of education at Birmingham, his words, because he had some, which I shared the article with you, the 7 poses in the constructivist classroom.
Mm.
Because again, from a philosophy background, we look at it and go like, huh, this has got a lot of it's built on a lot of sand here. But the term, and I'm guilty of using this term as well, that I'm a social constructivist educator and we use social constructivism in our classrooms because it sounds like the good, healthy thing to do.
Mhm.
It sounds like you're giving agency to your learners, you're empowering them to speak their own truth, to articulate themselves, and to construct knowledge on their own terms. And who doesn't want to be that person? No one wants to be like, well, you can to a point, but ultimately you're gonna have to tell me what I want to know, what I want to hear to a point.
Mm.
And then from there you can try and make more creative moves, but you're gonna have to show me you can play the basic chords before you can go and freestyle and start playing
Mm.
free jazz here. You're gonna have to show me you understand the basic chords here, basic harmonies. So there is an element of kind of facetiousness or kind of self-veiling in our approach. What we keep calling ourselves social constructives, and while okay, broadly we might employ, and I certainly employ, social constructivist techniques at certain junctures of my teaching sessions. So not in the lecture necessarily, where you've seen me talk. I can talk 15 minutes straight. That's a lecture. Not a lot of social constructivism going on there, apart from what's going
Mm.
on in the student's head, right? Maybe cognitive constructivism in that sense, then in the Piagetian model, or something I really have a lot of time for is Perry stages of contextual reasoning, where a student will go through 4 stages of complexity from when they become first year undergrads to say their final year, and they produce their own original research.
Mm.
Stages of complexity and contextual reasoning. We're scaffolding the approach, to use social constructivist language, building them through better knowing others, to use social constructivist language. But interestingly, those approaches are much more Socratic in method than they are strictly social constructivist.
Mm.
So and again, coming from philosophy, the clarity of terms and expressions is so fundamental here. We're using an umbrella term that's doing a lot of work, but it's not actually representative. I was to observe
Mm.
what a lot of lecturers do in my colleagues, for example. When I did observations when coming here, I was like, this is Socratic. This is sometimes straight out behaviorist. This is
Mm.
this is not social constructivism for the vast majority of sessions. And there are times
Yeah.
where we do group activities and breakout discussions, but that's not the overarching methodology at work here.
Mm. Yeah. No, I think in terms of what you said about it being a technique that
Yes.
you can deploy, I think that's quite. I quite like the idea to think about it like that instead, because I do feel like a lot of practitioners probably, you know, who would otherwise sort of label themselves as social constructivist in
Yeah.
terms of their approach to teaching,
Yeah.
probably most of the time when they're asking a question, they probably have some kind of like preferred answer in their
Oh,
head,
yeah. Yeah.
and where they're expecting, where the conversation goes,
Yeah.
and if it doesn't kind of quite go like that, most of them, or some of them at least, would probably try to redirect it to where they want it to go. And so
Okay.
obviously when it comes to that kind of way of using the social constructivist technique, you're not really actually sort of having a social constructivist approach purely in your
No.
teaching and learning, but it's
No.
just a way to kind of like, rather than me telling you the answers, why don't you tell me the answers
Yeah.
instead?
Yeah, it's Socratic. It's the ruse, Socrates, and you read like the Plato's Republic. I remember reading first year in philosophy, thinking this guy's just a bit of a cheeky bastard, really. He says, "What is justice?" Someone gives loads of answers about what justice is, and he says, "Well, did you ever look at it this way?" You're like, "Well, you know the answer, Socrates, you smart ass. You're just trying to make the other person articulate it themselves." So, but it's just similar to what we tend to do a lot of the time. And that's not to say there aren't original contributions to knowledge from students, but typically it would be unfair, I think, to assume that most first year students, or regardless of their maturity, etc., are going to give us groundbreaking stuff in the first year. They do sometimes, they do, but mostly we just want to see a secure knowledge, kind of adherence to academic integrity practices, and a kind of going back to academic literacies and that triangle, the socialization model. So we have the kind of skills model of higher education, the socialization model, and then the academic literacies approach, which seemed to put itself as the kind of top of this apex of this triangle of academic kind of suitability or aptitude, by saying that what we're advocating for is social constructivist approaches to knowledge that are emancipatory and student-centered, and that granting agency to them and doing away with skills that you need to learn these things and just basically roll them out, or skills, socialization, where you need to become socialized in the way we do things here, that you could actually change the way we do things here. But the academic literacies model, it flip-flops in the 25 years of literature on the topic from the kind of key proponents. They claim it's emancipatory, then they've gone back and said it's not emancipatory. They've claimed it's not normative, but they've claimed it and granted it normative status, that this is the kind of go-to model. But in order to get there, you need to have skills. There's one way to reference an APA 7th. There's no other way to do it. There's just one freaking way. You just have to learn how to do it. You can't be creative with it. You could use the most creative. Do you know what I mean? You could just learn how to use a different font, basically. But there's no creativity involved. It's just copying like rote, isn't there? There's nothing to learn apart from, okay, is this a website or is it a report? That's the kind of, maybe we have to do a bit of digging. But there's one way to do it, and there's a freaking handbook on it. And then socialization. These are the norms of engagement in our learning environments. And you might have done something similar recently, but I know I've certainly done it with a new group. You've not met these people. Right? What's our kind of shared ethos in this room? And they'll do the flip chart paper, all that respect, listen to others, that kind of stuff. That's socialization. That's saying in this environment, or Chatham House rules, which we mentioned to our students at the start of our years. Chatham House rules: safe space. We're going to say things. We're going to attack ideas, but they stay in this room. And there's respect for ideas here. And there's going to be extreme points of view on occasion, but that's okay. There's ideas being discussed here, not people necessarily. So there are norms of engagement. We have an Equality Act, and we have bullying, harassment at work codes of conduct. You cannot say certain things to people in a learning environment with no reprimand. Absolutely not.
To what extent is it subject specific, and or maybe like perhaps different levels of learning within a particular discipline?
Yes.
Would you say like there are certain occasions where it could be more appropriate to have, the social constructivist approach in nearer to its real form, than certain areas, or certain levels of study?
I think that's a brilliant question. It's a layered question. So a lot of the critique has come of social constructivism in higher education has come from the hard sciences. So the kind of, medical sciences, or, biology, physics, chemistry, where there's like sums and there's correct answers. They're like, what are you doing here? This is like, there's a correct answer to this. In some other universities, this could be different, but in this universe, this is how this works. Until you get to the level of quantum physics, then things get very weirdly interesting, which is why I say at fundamental groundedness, to come back to my point initially, social constructivism may be epistemically true in the sense that there is no certainty, and this is all kind of a simulation, as it were, and we are just simulating it, and it doesn't actually exist, But notwithstanding, to actually get things done and to get planes in the sky and to get trains running on time, we need to grant something some sort of epistemic or ontological status for other things to be able to happen. So although it might be a ruse, at kind of a deep level of philosophical skepticism, we still have to grant it some sort of status, that there are things out there and things happening in order to make planes fly, for example. But like I say, you get to the ironic, I'm thinking aloud here, obviously, you get to the extreme of the hard sciences and you have quantum theory, which is very counterintuitive and very interesting indeed. It shows you all your kind of certainty can kind of dissipate, which is very fascinating. But so a lot of pushback comes from those subjects. In the humanities, so philosophy, you look at things like religion, English, and so on. The practice of hermeneutics is key. Hermeneutics being the practice of reading. So it comes from reading religious scripts. People are going to read the Bible, read a passage in different ways. So exegesis, hermeneutics is kind of rooted into philosophy, religion, English, etc. We could all read, I don't know, Sense and Sensibility. We're going to read it in slightly different ways. And we can approach that through group discussions and ask ourselves how these themes relate to our contemporary context or womanhood in 2024, etc. But there's not a great deal of social constructivism going on. There's hermeneutical analysis. Now, when we enter the social sciences and the kind of mix that we're in, which is new to me, between the humanities and the hardline sciences, social scientists, this is where the usage of social constructivism I see is most problematic.
Mm.
So,
But I think like what one thing that I'm kind of still trying to work out myself, you know, it is the when I'm thinking about teaching learning, I feel like teaching itself can be non-constructivist, can be non-social constructivist, perhaps to some extent, as well. But then when it comes to learning, I think you've already touched on this. I find it difficult to think of a scenario where learning isn't constructivist.
okay, so yeah, so going back to the kind of the cognitive constructivism of Piaget, there's kind of 7 stages, which with stages of every 7 years, which was again just based on his observations of his grandchildren or something. So highly problematic, highly not verifiable or kind of generalizable. Then you have social constructivism, Vygotsky kind of filling in the gaps there, saying that individuals cognize, but they cognize within a context, right? Within
Mm,
a society. So we're not in a vacuum. We come from families, societies, groups, etc. So I would argue that the thing that's doing the same work for you and I, because I don't disagree with your point, and I don't think you disagree with my point of view, but I think I would call it critical realism, and you may still call it social constructivism, or you may find yourself very towards critical realism. But I think it's like a palimpsest. So there's kind of like one image coming towards another image. So the image that's been given by the lecturer or the academic or the YouTube video, whatever the input, sensory input is, um, and then the student or the learner, in this case, be your colleague, whatever it might be, um, bringing their own vantage points to that knowledge and
mm,
then meeting there. And I think therein lies what we would call constructivism, but also I think critical realism, that there is a shape building of the world, what justice looks like in the world, that this is an appropriate mode of justice based on things that have come to me from, say, other corners of the world, maybe 3,000 years ago, are informing how I live my life today. So
mm,
there is a constructivist element going on the mind of the learner, of course, but the sensory input is coming from times, places that may be, in some cases, completely foreign from a long, long time ago.
mm,
So there, and then we are getting closer to the notion, I think, as I say, a species, or maybe not. There's kind of critiques of way time or history works, but say we get closer to the idea of, I don't know, justice or kindness, what that looks like through discourse, through examples from the past. And I think therein lies critical realism, because the kind of the telos or the end goal of a critical realist approach is freedom, essentially, is truth, is kindness, is a world where no one goes hungry, right? That's the critical theoretical approach. I mean, let's bring in one of the big boys here, right? There's a good time to bring in one of the big boys. Paulo Freire. We all love Paulo Freire, don't we? Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right? You probably, used it in your teacher. Presumably taught Freire. You've cited Freire. We love Freire. Everyone loves Freire, right? Granddad Freire. Freire, emancipatory approaches to knowledge, kind of banking education and liberatory education, etc., right? Um, and but Kurt Biester made a really good point in 2017, and something that not a misgiving, because I love Paulo Freire's work. But what gets completely missed with Paulo Freire's outlook is that he's a liberation theologist, right? He's an esoteric Catholic. He believes in the salvation of Christ. He's a Catholic thinker. He has a telos of the afterlife. And I love how in social scientific circles, or kind of say, center left liberal higher education environments where he's taught or used, no one really talks about that. They just talk about, oh, you're great Paulo Freire, pedagogy of the oppressed, this kind of liberatory figure. But he's relying on something that a lot of people based on survey census data are non-believers, either atheists or agnostics, and do not have time for those kind of creeds, those kind of dogmatic teleological creeds of kind of afterlives and beliefs in kind of salvation of Christ, etc. But that's doing the work for Freire. His social constructivist kind of student-centered model of learning is based on a notion of emancipation that comes from biblical reading. And Biester said, my notes here, he says Freire himself operates as a conventional normative teacher, not only by telling others what they should and should not do, but also by expressing strong claims about the allegedly true nature of human beings. But that's someone we champion in the social sciences education as kind of this liberatory, emancipatory figure. But he is dogmatic. This
mm,
is goodness and this is bad. We must help the poor. we must help the poor. We must do away with kind of usury and exploitation of the poor. And do you know what? I absolutely agree with that.
Mm,
But I can defend my point of view based on my critical realist stance because I have an idea of what I think goodness is.
mm.
If you claim that you're a hardline social constructivist, you don't have epistemic grounds on which to argue that case.
Is it a form of social constructivism when you try to pick and mix what you want to hear
Yeah,
in an argument,
yeah.
in terms of what you've just basically given us as an example
Thank you. Oh, that's
of,
good.
what we could literally just kind of say, oh, that there is something that we are wanting to champion, and we don't need to take it, as it is. We can kind of just interpret it in a way
Thank
that.
you. No, thank you for that. But yeah, and I would qualify that by saying, look, in some cases there are ad hominem things, right? Like, so Heidegger was a Nazi. People say, should we read Heidegger? He's a really fascinating thinker. I find Heidegger a bit annoying in many ways, but his Nazism can inflect the way you read him, right? Other people, they might. I'm an Arsenal fan. Someone might be a Man United supporter. That's going to make me feel untowards towards them. I'm going to think, well, they can't have been as smart as they claim to be, right? But that's not a big deal. It's an ad hominem thing. The fact that they support a different team, or they may be a meat eater or a vegan or something, I don't know. It shouldn't affect how I read them, say, too much, during like the baby with the bathwater.
Mm,
But in this case, so there are some things that you kind of park, or, like, for example, with certain, I don't know, movie stars with their kind of sexual misdemeanors and stuff. To what point can we cancel a star, or, cancel culture and stuff? What can we grant or not? But with Freire, it doesn't matter whether he supported Man United or ate meat or not. The important thing is, in this case, you cannot, in my opinion, based on my reading, use Freire in the context of social constructivism and emancipatory approaches to education, and
mm,
do away with his Catholicism, because it was not an aside. It wasn't him supporting Man United. It was a fundamental basis of his ontological way of seeing and being in the world: salvation,
mm,
the sacrifice of Christ, etc., the day of judgment, etc., etc., biblical reading, liberation theology. It's liberation
mm,
theology. So you can't do away with that with Paulo Freire.
mm.
It's fundamental to his way of being and seeing the world. So it's like you said, it's complete cognitive dissonance to say, well, I'll take this bit, but I'll say, well, that he was probably just a bit silly, this naive religious belief, because we've kind of done away with those. No, you have to
Mm,
take those seriously.
mm. Talk to me about the in terms of the argument that constructivism, or maybe even social constructivism, can undermine the quality or effectiveness of pedagogy.
So pedagogy is the teaching of others. Right? Pedagogy, and it normally means usually younger than oneself, and it's built on a dynamic of the knower and the learner. And it usually involves core content, and it normally has a curriculum and a mode of assessment to show that learning has taken place. So that's pedagogy. Then you have andragogy, teaching adults. And then you have hertagogy, self-directed learning, which is what we advise students, we build students towards in their final years and, say, MA dissertation years and so on, especially at PhD level. That's just the guide on the side, and the person who's the PhD candidate is driving the ship. Um, so pedagogy, what was the question again?
In terms of the argument regarding how constructivism, or maybe even social constructivism, can undermine the effectiveness of pedagogy.
Yeah, sorry, that's it. Yeah, social constructivism is something we cite in our pedagogy, and I've been there. When I did my fellowship application 6 years ago, 5 to 6 years ago, I call myself social constructivist. My pedagogy is built on social, but there's a contradiction at the heart of that. That pedagogy is about the teaching of others, a better knowing others, telling the others where to get to. It's a Socratic method that may employ, as again what you said earlier, I'm not putting the baby out of the bathwater, may employ elements of social constructivism as a teaching technique within a toolkit of wider things, such as chalk and talk about certain things, meditation on something, going away, individual reflection, maybe times of solitude, maybe group discussion, etc., blogging, different. It's a toolkit of many other things to basically explore concepts and ideas.
Mm,
That's how I see it. But to call I'm a social constructivist pedagogue, I think that's a contradiction at the heart of it. I don't think you can be. I don't think you can be a social constructivist pedagogue. If you are, then what are you teaching students? You're teaching them to do what they want.
mm.
Absolutely, without any
Could,
kind of
could,
quality control.
but could you actually take a pragmatic approach to sort of not really, it could underpin, your approach to practice without it being completely fundamental, where you have to literally do everything it says.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a toolkit. It's a tool. It's a tool that can be used, employed by the pedagogue, say the teacher. It's a teaching tool of many other tools. Sometimes chalk and talk, etc. Insert option here, but it's duplicitous, self-duplicitous to say that I'm a social constructivist pedagogue. You're not. If you observe what you actually do in the classroom, if I was to observe you, not you per se, the kind of general you, but if you reflect on what you did, if I was to observe you, film you, and then you reflect on what was happening from every 5 minute block, I think it would be quite revealing how much of it is actually social constructivist and how much isn't.
But in terms of how you see yourself as like what you are
Yeah,
as a
yeah, I
practitioner,
know. I
isn't
know.
that socially constructed or constructed by yourself? So what I'm trying to say here really is that the way, I think that this is what one of the things I noted down earlier in terms of pedagogy itself, I think is inherently unique, because
Mm,
how someone does something
mm,
is kind of like, how you interpret questioning to be done, for
mm,
example,
mm,
is how you would do it, and
mm,
you can only do it to how you have understood it or how you are capable
mm,
of deploying such a tool. And so to some extent that lends itself more to me towards a social constructivist kind of outlook,
but
rather than something that you can prescribe something as it is, that is more dogmatic.
a social constructivist outlook. Okay, so the way I see the world is obviously the way the shades of color I see to this is go back to philosophical epistemology. So when people I'm actually sat in rooms where they're discussing redness, the redness of an apple, and we will all see a different red, right?
Mm,
So the world is cognitively constructed based on our vantage point, just how tall you are, etc., 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 and insert variables there. There is no doubting those, and knowledge is contextual, specific to the individual to a point, and then socially constructed through discourse, and we get to a general idea of what redness is. That's why
mm,
we all stop at traffic lights. We don't go, well, I look blue to me. No, we have a general idea of where redness is. Even if we're colorblind, we know that red appears at the top of the three icons on the traffic light, right? So this is kind of structuralism 101. Post-structuralism obviously enters the discourse. But I'm a big fan of post-structuralism, but it has its limitations. And
mm,
post-structuralism will come along and say, well, who designed those signs to be in that order? Who decided that red would be the indication to stop? Why
mm,
are those signs in that particular context? Why are there three? Why are they placed at a certain height, etc.? All worthy questions. But at some stage, to get anything done, we have to have a shared kind of consensus about things. Otherwise, the
mm,
world, otherwise we don't, knowledge doesn't get anywhere either.
mm,
And this is something that, again, say 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been arguing these points of views. I was going to be a hardline social constructivist. Like, no, no, it's all kind of been much more skeptical about the world. But when I actually have to sit back and reflect on how the world actually is or works, whilst
mm,
I said at the level of quantum physics, I grant that this could all be completely illusory. But within, so kind of coming to one extreme, but within the kind of life world as it is that we live in, we have to grant things status in order for discourse to get off the ground.
mm,
And that's where I think social constructivism has its limitations.
mm,
Because otherwise, having a discussion, we could just respond to each other non sequiturs because we're not. But the fact is, and I know, like this conversation now, or in your learning environments, there is general consensus and there is a general understanding from students about how things tend to work. Like students aren't going to typically get up and, I don't know, go to the toilet in the classroom. That would be a very odd thing to do, right? We know that's not socially acceptable in most
mm,
contexts, right? We're not Diogenes doing things in public in ancient Greece. So we know there are norms of engagement. And as you said earlier, so okay, the individual's doing it, they're cognizing about the world, they're taking in sensory inputs, but it's all happening in their head. But we're not, I mean, this basic biology comes into work here. We're not individual atomized units. We came
mm,
from a mother. We've got certain kind of genetic propensities, etc. We've come from an environment in which we were exposed to certain things. We are but a kind of conglomeration of the effects that the world has had on us
mm,
potentially, right? So we're never alone. We're never on our own just processing. We're always
mm.
with the others.
Yeah, but it's such a consensus that you mentioned reality, or just a socially accepted norm that can be obviously flexible. depending on the time, situation, person, that we're dealing with. So, you said earlier, you say like, there has to be some kind of norm that we have to work with, which I totally agree with. But then I suppose what I'm trying to clarify is, do you see that norm as something that, this is, because earlier you mentioned about, some kind of ethics that, there has to be something that we can say objectively, this is not acceptable. But then are you saying that this consensus that you've just mentioned is reality, as in the truth, or is it something that is still socially constructed within a system or domain?
The latter, yeah. So small t truth, not capital T truth, platonic realm of forms, ideal form of justice. I don't like the word objective again. I mean, I know I might appear as a bit of a walking contradiction. I'm happy to concede that, insofar as I have a lot of sympathy towards social constructivism. But as time has gone on, and I call myself a post-structuralist in certain contexts, but at the same time, I also see the limits of such a realm of, because it's not really a theory of knowledge, right? So going back to your thing about ultimate truth, no, I think social knowledge is socially constructed, small t, and it's fallible. So I don't think it's the word you said becomes objective truth. I don't think it's objective. I think it's by mass consensus. So I think most people in society will agree that genocide is wrong. You'd be very hard pushed to find people that like genocide or agree with genocide, but there are some people that are genocidal, right? And there are some societies that, what we see conflicts happening right now in the world, I don't need to go into them, where genocide is justified on certain grounds.
Is it time specific though?
It's context specific to a point, but if you look throughout human history, genocide has existed, or war kind of violence has existed from tribe on tribe. It's kind of, it seems to be the story of humanity. And right now, what we see going on in kind of, sectarian violence, or religious-based violence in certain parts of the world, power-based violence. But we have a notion that that is not good, right? Because but that's not saying that I'm not coming from the kind of religious doctrine or dogma saying thou shalt not kill. I think in certain contexts killing can be justified, right? So in certain contexts killing may be the best thing to do in certain contexts, without going into murky waters of what that might be and getting myself cancelled. But I'm not going to say that in certain contexts that's an objective truth. I don't think that's the case. I think it's by consensus. So there is, and again, I'm a critical realist, soft social constructivist. I'm not a hardline realist, and I'm not a hardline social constructivist. I'm unfortunately much more floating somewhere in the middle of the two, but I lean towards critical realism, because I think the dangers of social constructivism are too problematic, especially in today's council culture or echo chamber culture, where we're too easy. We don't engage with ideas of others. We're just like, that person's, I mean, I have colleagues, right? I've said the words, because if someone said or did something, that person's dead to me. As jokingly, I don't think they really wish death upon that, but that person's dead to me. Like, come on, man! You can't just cancel a whole person's humanity or way of seeing the world because you don't agree with them on a few particular points. They might be big points, but that's not to say that a Zionist hasn't got some really interesting points to make about aesthetics. They can make some brilliant points about aesthetics. You just happen to disagree with them on. And sometimes there are points where people draw the line and say, okay, I can't deal with. I can't take what this person says about X, Y, Z. Based on this one thing, but we need to, I think, because we're all a mess to some degree. None of us are kind of saints here. So small t, no objective, but socially kind of agreed norms, I think, is the way things happen. If I may here, the kind of thing that might flesh this out philosophically is the work of Jürgen Habermas, who's kind of like the foremost philosopher still alive today. He's about 160, and he worked on he wrote this book in, I guess, around the same time as about late 70s, early 80s, moral and communicative action. And he came up with this notion of discourse ethics. And he said there's an ideal speech situation where you enter into discourse and you follow certain rules, almost like due process in a court of law. Does a court of law always reach true justice? Is a person always lawfully acquitted or not? No, we know that not to be the case, based on race, power, money, the best lawyers in town. But there is a kind of model UN stuff, right? The way the UN works based on consensus or norms of engagement. Now, of course, countries like, say, Russia, for example, or Israel can say, we're not going to play by those rules, and there'll be sanctions employed. But they can still do what they want, knowing full well there are repercussions for those, because there are limitations. The UN has no authority per se. It's based on buy-in and power and reciprocation. And that is, I think, how society and individuals work at large as well. The UN is a kind of better nature of ourselves, right? 1948, post World War II. Let's not let this shit happen again, guys. Come on, that was bad. That's what it was formed out of. So similarly, Habermas's discourse ethics or kind of discussions that happen in a classroom are based around an agreement that, okay, we would like these to be desirable outcomes. We're going to accept this kind of discourse, but if you don't play by the rules, then you're gone. But, and this is where Michel Foucault entered the debate and critiqued Habermas and said, well, if I don't want to play by your idle speech situation, or if I want to go rogue, like some states like Russia say today, what are you going to do about it? You have to have a normative grounding on which to chastise me, because I can do what I want.
So applying that thinking to pedagogy, though, so in terms of the norm, that I don't know whether you've got a view on this particularly or not, but when it comes to what is seen as effective pedagogy, what would you see as the consensus right now?
Let me ask you that question. I won't do it again. I won't play this. I'll play this card once and once only. How would you qualify effective pedagogy?
It's a hard one, isn't it? I think because one of the challenges, I think, is because effective is a word that obviously requires the kind of socially constructed meaning, for it to actually make any sense, because, this is something that can be interpreted in many different ways, and it depends on your metrics, on how you want to measure pedagogy. So, for example, do you want engagement, or do you want attainment to be at a certain level? Do you want everyone to be active learners within an environment, or do you want everybody to be thinking in a particular way? And so I think it's problematic to really define what effective pedagogy means. I think engagement is probably one of those words that I would assume that many people would put forward as one of the elements. I can't imagine many people would say to me, I don't want any engagement in my pedagogy, and so that it can be effective. So I think engagement is definitely one of those things. And to have the learners involved in some way, it doesn't have to be active. It can be just, but I suppose it comes back to engagement. Like if you're listening to something actively, that's an engagement of some sort. But I suppose engagement can be interpreted as actually doing something, or just listening attentively. So I think effective pedagogy for me is to be able to communicate the learning that you want to take place in a way that can engage learners. Would be something that I'll put forward literally without even thinking about it. I've not thought about this question previously, and so for me that would be the first thing that springs to mind.
That's interesting, because spoiler alert, leads to my next. I've just put the ethics form in this morning for another next research project and it's called quote, "There are limits to being helpful," end quote. Lecturers' perspectives on student engagement in the social sciences. When myself and a colleague at the Open University are going to interview colleagues in the social sciences, ask them what they actually understand student engagement to mean. Because we know there's dwindling rates of attendance at the moment across the sector. And we saw that here at BG last year, and it was striking. For us, engagement will be just turning up some days. I don't care if you turn up hungover and you don't engage at all. Just you being in the room is a form of engagement to me. And that's not happening at the moment. And it seems to be, there's a Guardian article that went viral about a month ago. I can't remember the first name, but Otte, Otte, the surname. I think it was entitled, "I just don't see the point why students are just not going to in classes anymore." So effective pedagogy can only take place if there's even people in the room, or using learning analytics. How much time are there? So we did some research, not research, but light research or investigation, and the team was like, okay, of these students that aren't coming to sessions, how many of the lectures or seminars? So they're not just not coming to the lecture, coming to the seminars, they're not coming to anything. So are they engaging on Blackboard? And so we can see how many minutes they're spending using a kind of panopticon of kind of tools to see. They're not looking on Blackboard either, so there's very little engagement taking place. So it could. So again, I want to know what lecturers understand student engagement to mean, because I think it's turning up to the room at the very least,
Yeah.
for social constructivist discussions to even have a possibility of taking place, rather than a transactional mode of, here's some videos like in COVID times, now go off and do some tests or show me you've MCQs to show me you've basically learned or heard what I wanted you to hear for this mini test or some nonsense like that, some transaction. Going back to your question, I mean, I really vibe with what you said there. I really empathize with that perspective about effective pedagogy. But for me, I mean, I can answer the question. For me, it's not linked to TEF metrics or something about how much they, learn or contribute to society. For me, it's, are you thinking insofar as, are you recognizing the complexity at work here? So are you recognizing that this is a very messy topic? If I can get you to that state of, and if you come with a certain set of ideas that you think, okay, this is where I see, this is my philosophy of education, or this is my attitude towards education in war zones, I want you to leave this module, let's not say the seminar because it's a slow burner, but I want you to leave the module going, shit, the world is way more complex than I thought it was at the start of this module. That for me is when I think I've done my job. So that you can see why students find some of that quite annoying or draining, or kind of like, they're like, the students have come to me in my final year module, going back to our initial conversation pre-record about the model UN, have come to me year on year after my final year module on international dimensions in international education, and normally say to me that was the worst or most boring module they did during their university times. And I take that as a mark of pride, not because I'm a sadist, because I know what boring is doing there. Boring is the word that means that was challenging. That was challenging. I found that hard to engage with. But you should. The stuff we're doing is heavy. It's not fun. It's not easy. We're looking at deschooling society. We're doing some really heavy stuff about the white man's burden. We're doing some stuff that's going to unsettle your idea of what role education plays in the world at large, or schooling, sorry, more operatively than education. And so you're going to go off to do a PGC, and you've just done a module on the potential kind of dark side to schooling. You should be a bit uncomfortable. So
does that not support you, the idea of what you mentioned earlier regarding social constructivism, though, in terms of like kind of like the more extreme end, near that kind of relativism side of things, where what you're wanting to happen isn't necessarily about the knowledge that you want them to have, but more about them recognizing that the reality is a lot more complex. So then it is almost like you can kind of think what you want as long as like that this is complex.
No. I mean, you could. Okay. Let me be charitable. I would find it hard to square those two together. So you could think what you want as long as you I think. Okay. All right. Let me grant that. Let me grant that students can think what they want as long as they recognize it's complex. Because at the very least, if they still believe certain things about the world that they did before, that I don't know, the teaching of phonics in a certain way is the best thing for children's education based on this kind of now literacy trust kind of research in the last 10 years, which we might find something counterintuitive the next few years. I want you to recognize this fallibility at work here and complexity at work. So if the student at the very least will leave the degree course or leave a module going, my grounding is a bit less certain, that I take these to be my kind of going back to the initial points earlier about having a grounding. These are my groundings. These are my standpoints. Okay, I believe in X, Y, Z. These are my values, or this is my we do a second year module where we help students develop their philosophy of education, drawing on Beester and Bartlett and Burton. And students often will say, and this is a great module, I love how this one plans out, because they always say at the start, yeah, I'm a big fan of just individual learning, focus on the individual, student-centered learning. And they come up with portfolios that actually talk about the value of the knowledge economy and jobs and this. I was like, well, no, you sound a lot more like one of the conservative ministers of education for the last 14 years. But do you see what I'm trying to say? Or you actually value society much more than you do the individual, because individual flourishing takes place within society. So I know now we live in a neoliberal culture where there's no such thing as society. But students throughout the module come to realize, I said, if I was to ask this question 30 years ago, and they're onto it, said, if I asked this question 30 years ago to people in this room, what do you value? Say, broadly speaking, knowledge, for knowledge sake, or the sake of the economy and what society needs, or the individual flourishing, they all recognize that 30 years ago the answer would have been society, and to say anything against that would have seen as kind of like counter to the narrative. We're all it together, we look after each other. Social society comes first. And now 90% of students vote for the individual, but in their articulations, they don't actually champion individual freedom and expression and rights. They champion knowledge because they've grown up in a society of testing and the conservative government of the last 14 years and what they've done to the education system. So how a person describes themselves and what they want to think about themselves, we see this all the time in psychology tests, right? Was it called the I can't remember the two names, but there's which is ironic, the irony of this will come for you in a minute, but the theory the theory of when you're so silly or so limited in something that you don't know how silly you are. When you're so silly, you don't know you're silly. It's two names. Oh,
Not
the
sure I can help you
Dunning-Kruger
with that.
effect. Sorry,
Right.
the Dunning-Kruger, and the irony is I couldn't remember it because I'm so silly. But the Dunning-Kruger effect is if you don't know something, you don't have the ability to recognize you don't know it. So it's the kind of Johari window or something like that, right? You don't know what you don't know, but a lot of people claim to know things that they don't actually know. But they lack the efficacy to recognize their limitations. So similarly, taking from that's quite a hard criticism of most people, but it is most of us. I think they did a test. Kind of one of the stupid things about, it's always about the color red for some reason. They did this test in philosophy/psychology many years ago, where they asked people to rate themselves on their confidence of rating what color red the Coke can red is. Right, that's what they did. This is what people do with their spare time now as researchers. So most people said, "Yeah, I know what the red can is. I've drunk Coke all my life. I know. I could tell you the red." And they're given a choice and they vote. And invariably, the more confident people reported before they did the test, the less likely they were to guess the right red. And whereas the more kind of uncertain people reported at the start were more likely to get closer to the actual red. So that's a kind of real kind of win for uncertainty and doubt, as opposed to epistemological or ontological certainty. You need some sort of grounding. I have an idea what redness is. I know what Coke can is. I know it's a beverage made by a certain company, etc. But beyond that, I'm not so sure. I'm going to tread carefully here. And if you tread carefully in life, you're going to be less likely to make statements such as "this is good" or "this is bad," because you'll recognize this complexity at work here.
Yeah. Because I think, interestingly, I think when it comes to social constructivism and even like more towards the kind of relativism that you mentioned earlier, where you could kind of think what you think, or how you want to see the world, sort of narrative. I think to some extent, at least, you kind of need it for creativity. You kind of need it for it to not go into some kind of echo chamber culture that you mentioned before. Because without that kind of thinking of like, well, why do I have to think in the way that you're telling me to? And I'm going to be completely radical, and I'm going to think about something completely different and have a thought experiment of some sort that is totally like maybe even unethical at times, where that could then take you to somewhere that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. If you think like actually no, there is a consensus that you should have as a reference point, but then who is to say that that consensus isn't completely wrong, and actually we should be challenging that with some kind of dose of social constructivism, even if it's just a temporary thing, just to take you somewhere.
I completely agree with you. Again, I'm all for that notion of kind of radical creativity, or the kind of trickster ethic, which I've researched on in the past. I'm all for that, but we have to recognize that within. And I'm a big fan of the kind of trickster ethic as opposed to the kind of normative heroic ethic. But we have to recognize that there's Nietzsche would call the Dionysian impulse as opposed to what we call the Apollonian impulse. But those things are dialectically enmeshed, meaning I cannot say, I'm going to go say, screw this, I'm going to do this radical different thing. Radical means to get to the root of something. That itself is interesting, to get to the root of something, then go back to Plato. But to be radical, to be responding to something, you have to have the normative thing to respond to. So like waves of music will respond to what's going on in the popular culture. We're going to do pop music, right? Pop culture, popular culture. We're going to do something that's more avant-garde or reactionary, but it needs the thing to react to in order to be able to do the thing it does. Otherwise, it's just random. It doesn't make any sense. It needs to be engaging with normative frameworks. Otherwise, we're like, I don't even understand what you're doing for me to recognize you're doing something different.
Yes, yeah. No, I think I agree with you in that sense, because of creativity. The way I see it is that it is a system-specific thing where you have to have a reference point as like the norm, because how can you have creativity where something is novel when you don't know what the norm is?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's contextual, going back to the constructivism element, social constructivism. It is socially bound and contextually bound. But this goes back to the point of aesthetics and why there are problems with constructivism, say, in ethics, as opposed to, say, critical realist outlook. There is such a thing as good music, even if you don't like it, say. This music is intellectually okay. I'm not going to go into highfalutin examples here, but some music you could say is interesting or good or experimental, and it deserves to be respected for what it did, even if you don't like the results sonically. So that's the case in point. Otherwise, we could just say, you know, Beethoven's the same as the Sugar Babes. Some people might say the Sugar Babes are better than Beethoven. But then again, you could ask which Sugar Babes, because there's so many different members. You know, that's itself a philosophical. Departments have spent time on trying to understand what the Sugar Babes are. It's like the ship of Theseus or Trigger's broom. So there needs to be a notion of what is good music, right?
Yeah. Okay. So to round it up, I think going back to the kind of pedagogy thing, would you say that it is your standpoint when it comes to you know, the value of constructivism or social constructivism in teaching and learning or in pedagogy, that you need a mixture of different approaches, which includes both, you know, constructivist, social constructivist, and also the other approaches that are seen as non-constructivist, constructivist, and so on. You know, so it's about, and also would I be able to add to it that you are thinking that it's something that would depend on the situation, the audience, and the context regarding what tools you would want to use, even if the thesis is you want to use a mixture, but then in different circumstances it might mean that actually you don't use as many, or you wouldn't use a particular tool for that reason.
You know my answer. The answer is yes. Okay. So here, let me put some power back. Let me end on a kind of high note, right? Put some agency back towards the lecturer, the academic, or the teacher, or facilitator, or pedagogue, whatever you want to call yourself, social constructive. You can put yourself whatever you want, right? But I think what marks, because there are better educators and not so good educators. Okay, I'm making that claim. Right? Shoot me down. No, there are some educators you're like, wow, you are inspiring. I want to learn about what you're teaching, even though I have no interest in, I don't know, geography, but I really want to learn that, right? And there are others where you think, oh my God, you know so much, but this is just, I'm not engaged, right? Going back to your word of engagement. We know it and we feel it when we see it, and there's different styles for different people, granted, but we know good teaching when we see it, kind of thing, right? Otherwise we wouldn't do a pair of observations and do feedback, etc. So going back to your point there, and I completely agree with what you're saying. You've taken the words out of my mouth, and it's kind of loaded in the sense that, yeah, social constructivism is a toolkit. A very sympathetic observer we cited in the research, Perkins, 2006, said, if a particular approach does not solve the pedagogical problem, try another. Try more structured, try less structured. More discovery oriented, less discovery oriented. Whatever works. Teaching by telling may just work fine. As a person who leads towards social constructivism. But I think the bright note we can end on, you can become a better educator, or you can support a better educator by someone who is flexible enough to go in with a plan and to be able to change it based on the dynamics of the room. Because we all know if it's snowing outside, I don't care how old the learners are, you can have the best lesson plan in the world, they're looking outside the window and getting distracted. And you have to, or the post-lunch slump, or other things we know are observable phenomena over years. A better educator is someone who can draw on different tools in their kit bag. Social constructivist, maybe a behaviorist one, maybe something different, critical realist approach, but mix it up and to be able to be flexible. One of my students said something else that I thought was surprising feedback. The student said, your class is a bit chaotic. They go, it's just chaos. It's just chaos. And I thought, that's really fascinating, because I think it's too structured. I think it's too structured. I know what time, I know what kind of where I'm going to go. But they thought it was chaotic, but fun and stimulating and engaging. But I thought it was quite structured. But what I think that they're alluding to is the fact that I will go off piste. I will go to do this isn't working. Right, go stop this. We're gonna try something else. I'm not wedded to my tool. It's just a tool. I'm not going to keep using the hammer. If you've got a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right? You know, if you're a social constructivist, then everything's up for grabs, right?
Okay, so in other words, we're ending on pragmatism.
Ending on creativity, flexibility.
Love that.